Fling was originally printed in 1998's Stronghold. It's an instant for one generic and a red, and as additional cost to cast it, you sacrifice a creature, and then Fling deals damage equal to the sacrificed creature's power to any target. It's a fun, flavorful design because it basically lets you chuck one of your creatures at your opponent or one of their creatures. And not only is it flavorful, you can also do some pretty powerful things with this kind of effect. Since the debut of the original Fling, there have been dozens of cards with similar or identical effects to the original, and as is often the case, the slang term for that effect comes from one of the older cards to have that effect, in this case, Fling. Fling actually isn't the first card with this type of effect. Sword of the Ages and Final Strike have similar effects, but Fling is the name that has stuck around. For the purposes of this video, I defined a Fling effect as one that lets you sacrifice a creature to have it do damage or make the opponent lose life equal to the sacrificed creature's power. I chose to expand the list beyond cards that only do damage equal to the sacrificed creature's power because in your typical game of Magic, life loss effects really aren't that different from doing damage, and if life loss or damage is the only difference between two types of effects, which both still sacrifice a creature and have an effect that lowers the opponent's life total equal to the sacrificed creature's power, it doesn't seem necessary to me to give those cards a different designation because of the small mechanical difference between damage and life loss. In all, there are 41 cards that qualified for this list, and in this video we'll look at the 10 Fling effects that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. Before we get to the top 10, I do have one honorable mention. It's a card that would have made the list, and it technically qualifies for it, and that is Starlit Sanctum. It's a land that can tap for colorless, and it has 2 activated abilities. You can pay a white, tap it, and sacrifice a cleric to gain life equal to the sacrificed creature's toughness, or you can pay 1 black, tap it, and sacrifice a cleric to have target player lose life equal to the sacrificed creature's power. It's that second ability that would qualify it for the list, but the problem is that in the decks that have put up top 8s with Starlit Sanctum, that second ability was never used. This is because it was played in combo decks that look to grow Daru Spiritualist's toughness by targeting it repeatedly with Shuko and other free targeting effects, and then sacrifice it to gain 1,000,000 life. There was no combo in the deck that ever allowed the other activated ability to make the opponent lose more than 1 life, and that's just not what the deck was interested in doing. So it qualifies in a technical sense, but I didn't think it was right to include it when the Fling effect was pretty much ignored by the decks that used the card. At number 10, it's Bloodchin Fanatic. For 1 generic and 2 black, it's a 3/3, and you can pay 1 generic and a black and sacrifice another warrior to have target player lose X life and you gain X life, where X is the sacrificed creature's power. So this is a Fling effect that can only lower the opponent's life total, but it also gains you life, although the fact that you can only give up other warriors is a pretty big limitation. The good news is there was a warrior deck that put up some top 8s in Standard in 2015. While that deck was mostly an aggro deck that won just by curving out, it could win even when the opponent stabilized thanks to the Fanatic. Sacrificing Blood-Soaked Champion every turn was an especially good way to get there. However, Bloodchin Fanatic doesn't have any top 8 since 2015. At number 9, it's Ziatora the Incinerator. For 3 generic, a black, a red, and a green, she's a 6/6 flyer, and at the beginning of your end step, you can sacrifice another creature, and when you do, Ziatora deals damage equal to that creature's power to any target, and you create 3 treasure tokens. So, Ziatora's Fling effect is identical to the original Fling, in that it can hit any target, but you also get some treasure in exchange for giving up that creature. That's pretty awesome since you're already getting some good value out of the creature you give up. Throw in the fact that Ziatora is also a superimposing 6 mana 6/6 flyer, and we're talking about a very powerful card. Her top 8s all came in Standard in 2022, particularly in decks that could generate extra value with treasure, like Magda and Goldspan Dragon. One kinda sweet thing about playing Ziatora with Magda was the fact that Ziatora could pretty easily give you the treasure to search up another Ziatora if you ended up in a spot where they managed to take the first one down. However, it doesn't have any top 8 since 2022. At number 8, it's Grab the Reins. For 3 generic and a red, it's a modal instant with 2 options. You can gain control of target creature and it gains haste, and the other effect is what qualifies it for this list because it's a typical Fling effect. You sack a creature, and Grab the Reins does damage equal to its power to any target. It also has Entwine for 2 generic and a red, and if you pay that additional cost, you get both modes at once. Yeah, this is a pretty sweet Threaten variant, precisely because it's also a Fling variant. The ideal thing is to entwine this, because it means you steal your opponent's best creature, attack them with it, and then fling it at them or at one of their creatures. This is a super swingy play that can generate a 2-for-1 in most cases, and can often find lethal out of nowhere. Notably, this card is also an instant, making both options significantly better. Stealing a creature at instant speed can mean that sometimes you set up a block that kills 2 of your opponent's creatures, and flinging something at instant speed means you can do it in response to removal. Its top 8s all came in 2004 in Mirrodin block constructed in Standard, but it doesn't have any top 8s since then. At number 7, it's Voldaren Thrillseeker. For 2 generic and a red, it's a 1/1 and it has backup 2, which means when it enters, you put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature, and if it's another creature, it gains the following ability until end of turn, and that ability, which the Thrillseeker itself also has, is a Fling effect for 1 generic where the creature sacrifices itself. So, the Thrillseeker can just put the counters on itself in a pinch, giving you a 3 mana 3/3 with Fling upside, but putting the counters elsewhere can also allow you to do lots of damage out of nowhere. Like if you now have a big creature that they can't block, which you can also potentially fling at them after they take the damage. It's been featured in mono red and Gruul aggro decks in both Standard and Pioneer, and it has recently become an especially important card in both formats, as decks really lean on buffing creatures so they are massive by using combat tricks. Heartfire Hero is one of the better creatures in those decks because it can rapidly grow. And when it dies, it already does damage equal to its power to your opponent, so if you put a bunch of counters on it with Thrillseeker, which also triggers Valiant, and then sacrifice it with the Thrillseeker's added ability, we're already talking about 8 damage. And that's if the hero started out as a 1/1 and also can't attack your opponent and do damage. So you can see how nice the Thrillseeker is in a deck like that. It can allow for some pretty absurd starts. These decks are still doing well in both Standard and Pioneer, and the Thrillseeker is likely to move up the list in the future. At number 6, it's Thud. For 1 red mana, it's a sorcery that requires you to sacrifice a creature as an additional cost to cast it, and it deals damage equal to the sacrificed creature's power to any target. In other words, it's Fling for half the mana, but it's also downgraded to a sorcery, making it a lot less interactive. It didn't see much play in Standard, but people have found a variety of ways to use it in Pioneer. For example, Jeskai Ascendancy combo decks, which are all about casting a bunch of spells in a single turn and constantly untapping their creatures and growing them, which can be accomplished by using mana-producing creatures like Sylvan Caryatid, could use Thud to sacrifice one of their huge creatures and win the game that way. More recently, it's been played in the same Heartfire Hero decks as Voldaren Thrillseeker, and it's also seen sporadic play in modern Hardened Scales, which sometimes runs Thud as a sideboard card to bring in against people who can make it so you can no longer attack with Ensnaring Bridge and the like. Thud is still putting up top 8s in Pioneer, so it's got a good chance at moving up the list in the future. At number 5, it's Rite of Consumption. For 1 generic and a black, it's a sorcery that requires you to sack a creature as an additional cost, and it deals damage equal to the sacrificed creature's power to target player or planeswalker, and you gain life equal to the damage dealt that way. So this is basically a black Fling, even doing damage instead of causing life loss like most black effects, although it can hit creatures, but it does also gain you life in the process. Despite being printed in 2008, no one really found anything good to do with this card until 2015, when it started to see play in Dark Depths combo decks, primarily in the sideboard. Dark Depths decks look to get the Merit Lage token into play in the extreme early game, which they can accomplish with Vampire Hexmage or Thespian Stage, and while they typically win just by attacking with their huge token, sometimes your opponent does stuff to make that more difficult, and Rite of Consumption gives those decks a way to get around effects that prevent them from attacking. The Rite is also played in Pauper, a format where only commons are legal. There it's played primarily in mono-black aggro decks, which are all about sacrificing creatures to grow their creatures to massive size, with powerful sacrifice outlets like Carrion Feeder and payoffs like Mortician Beetle. These decks run main deck Rites of Consumption and can often close out the game with it. Rite of Consumption is still active in Pauper right now, and it has a good shot at moving higher on the list. At number 4, it's Kazuul's Fury. For 2 generic and a red, it's an instant with identical text to Fling. At first glance, That might look like a strictly worse Fling, but it's not that simple, because Kazuul's Fury is a modal double-face card, meaning that you can choose to play either side of it, and the other side in this case is Kazuul's Cliffs, a land that enters tapped and can tap for red mana. So the front side might be a worse Fling, but unlike Fling, you can play this as a land when you need to. The great thing about these modal double-face cards is that they're good to draw whether you're flooding out or in need of a land, and as sweet as Fling effects can be, they are sometimes entirely useless, since you need to have a creature worth sacrificing and that's not automatic, and this helps get around that downside. Most of its top 8s came in Standard, where it was often played in aggressive decks, where, like many Fling effects, it could be used to close out the game. It also used to be played in Pioneer, where it was quite handy in decks using Crackling Drake. The Drake often had very high power, so much that hitting your opponent with it and then flinging it at your opponent could do lethal. However, Kazuul's Fury doesn't have any top 8 since 2022, and some of the cards that are right behind it right now are much more active than it is. At number 3, it's Callous Sell-Sword. For 1 generic and a black, it's a 2/2, and it enters with a +1/+1 counter on it for each other creature that died under your control this turn, but it also has an adventure called Burn Together, and that's the part of the card that qualifies it for this list. If a creature has an adventure, it means that you can cast that side of the spell and exile the card, and then cast it as a creature later in the game. In this case, you get a sorcery that has target creature you control do damage equal to its power to any other target, and then you sacrifice it. Mechanically, this is different than the other cards on the list, which get rid of the creature first, and then have the creature do damage equal to their power, while this has them do the damage, and then they get sacrificed. But it's only slightly different, and it definitely feels like a Fling effect to me. It does actually make it a little bit weaker for it to work this way, because if your opponent kills the creature in response, nothing happens. If you have the mana, it is nice that you can use the Fling effect and then cast the creature to get a 2-mana 3/3 all in the same turn. The adventure creature split here also means that, like Kazuul's Fury, this helps you get around the situational nature of Fling effects, because if you just really need a 2-drop, this can be one, unlike most Flings. It's put up top 8s in the same Standard and Pioneer aggro decks as Voldaren Thrillseeker, that is, those decks that can buff creatures like Heartfire Hero and throw them at the opponent, where the Sell-Sword is really the preferred Fling effect for the deck, since it is so much cheaper to set up and can still be a creature when you need it to be. In that deck, the fact that the Sell-Sword targets the creature and has it do damage also means you can trigger Valiant when you're only spending 1 mana, which is pretty sweet. Callous Sell-Sword is going to continue to put up top 8s, and it's not out of the question that it moves higher on the list in the future. And the number 2 Fling effect is, well, Fling. The namesakes of certain effects don't always make their respective top 10, but Fling does. And it even has a pretty high spot, with only 1 card ahead of it. Despite being originally printed back in 1998, Fling didn't start to see significant play in 60-card formats until 2005, when it started to appear in vintage Psychotog decks. These control decks really only ran 2 creatures. Psychotog, a creature that could grow rapidly with a big graveyard and lots of cards in hand, and Darksteel Colossus, an already huge creature that the deck could cheat into play with Tinker. Sacrificing either of those to Fling is pretty strong, as it means you can find lethal with your Tog or Colossus much earlier in the game. Fling didn't start seeing play in Standard until 2010, when it became legal there again as a result of a reprint. However, it didn't really see consistent play in the format until it got yet another reprint, this time in 2017. It was most played in adventure decks, which ran Fae of Wishes and could grab their Fling out of the sideboard when it was at its best. That's a pretty powerful way to do things, since it keeps you from drawing Fling when it isn't useful, but you still have access to it on turns where it gives you lethal. It's also seen some play in the aforementioned Legacy Dark Depths decks, and it's commonly played in Pauper, where it's been played in a variety of decks over the years. The most notable of these is perhaps the Atog Artifact deck, which could sacrifice tons of artifacts to make a massive Atog, and then fling it at the opponent. This style of deck was so successful that ultimately Atog got banned out of the format. It still sees play in a variety of decks in the format today, though especially in sacrifice decks. Fling is putting up top 8s in Pauper right now, and it's certainly the kind of card that is likely to get a reprint at some point, and if the format is right for it, you can bet it'll see play in Standard again. However, it's probably not going to catch the number 1 card on the list, which is Minsc and Boo, Timeless Heroes. For 2 generic, a red and a green, it's a 3 loyalty planeswalker, and when it enters, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you may create a legendary 1/1 red hamster creature token with trample and haste. It's the -2 ability that qualifies this Planeswalker for the list, because it has you sacrifice a creature, and then Minsc and Boo do X damage to any target where X is that creature's power, and if you chose to fling a hamster at them, you also draw X cards. And this fling effect works great with Minsc and Boo's +1, which puts 3 +1/+1 counters on up to one target creature with trample and haste. This has quickly proven to be one of the strongest Planeswalkers ever printed. Minsc and Boo ends up giving you a 4/4 hamster the turn you play it, and from there you can keep buffing it, making a more effective attacker, and you can eventually fling it at something to draw tons of cards and do tons of damage. The great thing is that Minsc and Boo's triggered ability makes sure you get a hamster even if you flung it at your opponent on the previous turn, so it ends up being a pretty amazing value engine that makes tokens, does damage, and draws lots of cards. It's very tough to overcome. They were able to make this Planeswalker this strong though because it's from a commander set, which means the only 60 card formats it's legal in are Legacy and Vintage, but even though it's limited to Magic's 2 most powerful formats, Minsc and Boo has been highly successful in both of them since being printed in 2022. It sees play in a wide variety of decks in both formats, though it is most frequently featured in more aggressive decks like Initiative Stompy. Minsc and Boo is going to continue to put up top 8s, and this card will likely remain the #1 fling effect in Magic for the foreseeable future. So, those are Magic's top 10 fling effects. If you like throwing your creatures at your opponent, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at effects and mechanics, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.